They pushed me down the stairs for refusing to sign my own life away. That is the truth I woke up to, and if anyone ever doubts me, I will tell them exactly how it happened, because my own son and his wife thought that breaking my bones would be easier than breaking my will. I have lived in this house for over 30 years, and every wall holds a memory of my labor, my sacrifices, and my stubborn determination to build something solid after so many storms. When my husband passed away, this place became more than 4 walls. It became my sanctuary, a promise to myself that I would never again depend on someone else to keep a roof over my head. I paid the mortgage with double shifts, with swollen feet from standing in the hospital ward, with overtime hours nobody else wanted to take, and I held the deed in my hands like it was my shield against a world that had often treated black women, like me, as if we were disposable. That house meant freedom, security, dignity. It was where I planted azaleas along the fence, where I rocked my first grandbaby to sleep on the porch, where I stitched quilts during long nights while the rain hammered on the roof. I thought the house would protect me. I never imagined it would be the very reason my own blood would betray me. My son Darius had grown up running through these same hallways, climbing the banister I told him not to touch, eating the cornbread I baked on Sundays, and swearing up and down he would always look after me when the years caught up to me. He used to say, "Mama, you'll never have to worry when I'm grown, because I'll take care of you like you took care of me." Those words meant something back then. Back when he was still a boy with scraped knees and a heart not yet hardened by greed or shaped by the easy smiles of people who told him he deserved more than what his mother could ever give him. I didn't see the shift at first, the way ambition can twist into entitlement, the way gratitude can turn into resentment when children convince themselves they are owed something for simply existing. But it was there, growing under the surface like rot beneath polished wood. When Darius married Monique, I told myself I would give her a chance. She was polished, educated, with that way of speaking that made her sound like she was always rehearsing for an audience, even in casual conversation. At first, she brought me flowers, asked about my health, said she admired the strength it must have taken to raise a child on my own after my husband's death. But little by little, her questions turned into suggestions, and the suggestions turned into instructions. And before I knew it, I could feel her trying to rewrite the story of my life, trying to move me from the center of my own narrative to the background. She would point out the creaking stairs that needed repair, the old roof that might not last another winter, the fact that I lived alone in a neighborhood where people whispered about break-ins. She never said it outright, but I could hear the message beneath her words. I was too old to manage my own affairs. I was supposed to hand the reins over, step aside gracefully, let them decide what was best for me. It started with paperwork, as these things often do. "Mama, you should let us help you with the bills. Make things easier," Darius said one evening, sliding a stack of envelopes across the table. "We can set up automatic transfers. We can make sure nothing gets lost. All it takes is a signature." I remember laughing softly, saying I had paid bills long before he was born, but he insisted, pressing my hand with that mix of charm and insistence he had always used when he wanted something badly. I pushed the papers aside, not realizing then that refusing to sign would plant the seed of their frustration. To them, my independence wasn't strength. It was an obstacle. Weeks passed, and the tension thickened. Every visit ended with more talk about documents, about guardianship, about how modern families manage assets together. I told them no every single time. I thought my firmness would close the matter. But the more I resisted, the more I could see their smiles harden, their voices sharpen, their patience thinning into something darker. They stopped visiting to share meals or check on me. Instead, Each encounter became a negotiation, a test of how far they could push me before I bent. The night it happened, I had gone to bed early with a book, the house quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. I had just slipped my glasses onto the nightstand when I heard the front door creak open. My heart skipped, because Darius and Monique both had keys, and I had learned long ago that people don't use keys at that hour unless they want to catch you off guard. I rose, pulling on my robe, and walked out into the hallway. They stood by the stairs, their silhouettes framed by the glow of the porch light spilling through the glass. Darius smiled, but it was tight, forced. Monique held a manila folder against her chest like it was a weapon. "Mama," he said gently, too gently, the way you speak when you are trying to soothe a frightened animal. "We need to go over some things. It's just paperwork, nothing heavy." I shook my head immediately, my chest tightening. "Not tonight. Not ever. I told you. I'm not signing anything I don't understand." I tried to step past them, but Monique moved closer, her perfume sharp and overwhelming, her voice cut in, no longer soft. "You're being unreasonable. This house could be gone in a heartbeat if something happens to you. Do you want to leave your son with nothing but debts?" Her words stabbed me, because they weren't just about the house. They were about rewriting the history of who I was, reducing me to someone incapable, someone who needed her own child's permission to exist. I turned away, my hand gripping the banister, my body trembling with anger I hadn't felt in years. "I survived more than you will ever know," I said, my voice shaking but loud. "Don't you dare talk to me about debts. Everything here was bought with my blood and my back, not with yours." That was when it happened. A shove, sudden and violent, from behind. My foot slipped on the edge of the stair, and the world tilted. I remember the blur of shadows, the sharp crack of my ribs as I struck the railing, the sickening thud when my head hit the bottom step. Pain burst through me like fire, and then everything went dark, sound collapsing into silence, as if the house itself swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes again, I was not in my home, but under the sterile light of a hospital room. My throat was dry, my body bandaged, my mind foggy. A monitor beeped steadily beside me, each note a reminder that I was still alive, though I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. For a moment I thought I was alone, until a nurse appeared at my bedside, her face calm, but her eyes carrying something urgent. She glanced at the door, then slipped a small envelope into my hand. "I think this belongs to you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I frowned, confused, but she pressed my fingers closed around it. "Be careful," she added, before walking away as if nothing had happened. Inside the envelope was a flash drive, plain and ordinary, yet heavy with possibility. My hands shook as I clutched it against my chest, my heart pounding not from injury, but from the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had seen what was being done to me. I didn't know yet what was on it, but I knew instinctively that this was not just a piece of plastic. It was proof. It was truth. It was perhaps the only weapon I had left in a battle I hadn't even realized I was fighting until it nearly cost me my life. I knew then that they hadn't just pushed me. They had planned to erase me. Those were the words echoing in my mind as I stared at the small flash drive in my hand, the nurse's whisper still hanging in the air. My fingers trembled as I turned it over, the cheap piece of plastic weighing more than any stone, because I understood it was not an ordinary object, but a doorway into the truth that could either save me or bury me. I tucked it under my pillow as though it were a fragile relic, my body aching with every movement, the bandages on my ribs pulling tight, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. They thought I was broken, that the fall had left me weak, dazed, and ready to be molded into compliance. What they did not know was that pain can clear the fog of denial better than anything else, and for the first time I allowed myself to see the danger I was truly in. The next morning, when the nurse came to change my dressings, I asked in a low voice if she knew anything about what was on the drive. She hesitated, glanced at the hallway to make sure no one was listening, and shook her head. "I shouldn't even have given it to you," she said, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and solidarity. "But someone slipped it to me and told me to make sure it got to you, and I couldn't just ignore it. You need to look at it as soon as you can." That urgency planted itself inside me like a seed, growing stronger with every hour. I borrowed a small hospital laptop later that day, claiming I needed it to order groceries and pay bills online. The nurse looked at me with quiet understanding and handed it over, no questions asked. When I plugged the drive in, my heart thudded so loudly I was afraid it would bring the whole floor running. At first, there was nothing but folders, neatly labelled with dates and dry titles, the kind of clinical organisation that suggested someone meticulous, someone who knew exactly what they were collecting. I opened the first folder and froze. It was a PDF scan of a legal document, my name at the top, my address in bold letters, and below it a signature that was supposed to be mine but wasn't. The letters curled in ways I had never written them, the pen strokes smooth and practiced, but they screamed forgery. It was a transfer of deed, a contract moving ownership of my house from me to my son Darius, signed and notarized, except I had never laid eyes on it until that moment. My breath caught in my chest as the realization slammed into me. They had already tried to steal my house on paper, and when I refused to sign, they decided to use force. I kept clicking, each file another dagger, bank statements with my name stripped from the account, replaced with Darius's. Letters to a lawyer about declaring me mentally incompetent, citing evidence of confusion and episodes of memory loss I had never had. Emails between Monique and a notary, arranging appointments behind my back, the words dripping with confidence that it would all be finalized soon. In one message, Monique even wrote, "She's too proud to admit she can't handle things anymore. We'll take care of it, and she'll thank us later when everything is secure." My hands clenched so hard, the skin around my knuckles turned white. They weren't just stealing from me. They were erasing me, writing a story where I was nothing but a helpless old woman who needed her children to clean up her mess. Tears blurred my vision, not from weakness, but from rage, because I remembered every night I had stayed awake at the hospital when Darius was sick as a boy, every shift I had worked back to back to keep food on the table, every promise he had made to me about taking care of me when I was older. I had carried him in my arms when he was fragile, and now he wanted to carry me out of my own house, like a piece of discarded furniture. The betrayal cut deeper than the fall down the stairs, deeper than the broken ribs, because bones can heal. But the knowledge that your own child values you less than property leaves a wound that never closes. I printed nothing. I saved nothing. I only memorized as much as I could before I pulled the drive out and slid it under my pillow again. I knew if anyone found it, it would disappear, and I would be left with nothing but accusations that sounded like the ramblings of a paranoid old woman. I lay there in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting each one as if they could anchor me against the tidal wave rising inside me. I was scared, yes, because I understood now that what happened on the stairs wasn't clumsy anger or a heat-of-the-moment shove. It was deliberate, calculated, and if I hadn't survived, the papers would have spoken louder than I ever could. My death would have been framed as an accident, and my son and his wife would have walked into my home like rightful heirs, grief on their faces and greed in their pockets. Later that day, when Darius came to visit, his smile wide and his voice dripping with concern, I watched him differently. He sat by my bedside, holding my hand, asking about my pain, calling me Mama, with that same honeyed tone he had used as a boy. But now I could hear the rot underneath. "You gave us a real scare," he said, stroking my arm gently. "Monique and I just want to make sure you're safe. When you get out of here, we should go over some things. Make sure all the paperwork is in order so nothing like this ever happens again." I smiled weakly, nodding, playing the part of the fragile patient. But inside my mind, I was replaying every line of those emails, every forged stroke of my stolen signature. I could see the glint in Monique's eyes when she walked in with flowers, could feel the way her gaze darted to my bedside table, as if she were searching for something hidden. I said nothing, because silence was my only weapon at that moment. If they knew I had proof, the danger would double, and I could not afford to tip my hand too early. I let them fuss over my pillows, adjust my blanket, offer to bring me my favorite food, and I thanked them like the grateful mother they wanted me to be. But the truth burned in my chest, sharper than any cracked rib. They had tried once and failed, and if I wasn't careful, they would try again, this time making sure I wouldn't wake up to tell the tale. That night, lying in the dim light of the hospital room, I whispered to myself words I hadn't spoken in years. "Lord, give me strength." I wasn't praying for comfort, not anymore. I was praying for endurance, for clarity, for the kind of unshakable spirit my mother and grandmother had carried when they faced men who wanted to silence them, systems that wanted to strip them, neighbors who never believed them. I could feel their voices rising in me, reminding me that dignity is not given, it is fought for. I held the flash drive in my palm as if it were a weapon forged by their hands, a piece of truth that could not be ignored forever. The catalyst was not just the fall, not just the betrayal, not just the evidence I now held. The catalyst was the realization that my survival was not enough. If I stayed silent, if I allowed them to gaslight me into doubting my own mind, then everything I had worked for, my house, my savings, my legacy, would vanish, swallowed by the greed of the very child I had once carried in my arms. And so, with my body weak but my spirit fierce, I made a promise to myself under the sterile light of that hospital room. I would not let them win. They looked at me with smiles, but I could see the hunger in their eyes. That was the thought that stayed with me the first time Darius and Monique came to the hospital after I had opened the flash drive and seen what they had planned. Before that moment, I had been clinging to a fragile hope that maybe I had misread things, that maybe the push on the stairs had been a cruel impulse, but not a deliberate attempt to erase me. Hope can be stubborn like that, trying to soften betrayal so it doesn't cut so deep. But once I saw the forged signatures, the correspondence with lawyers, and the cold way they had mapped out my erasure, I understood that what I was looking at was not weakness or poor judgment. It was greed sharpened into strategy. The morning of their visit, I had asked the nurse to keep the blinds half closed because the light was too harsh on my eyes. But in truth, I wanted the room dim enough to conceal the intensity of my stare. I had been practicing in the mirror above the sink, training my face into the expression of a woman who was tired, confused, and grateful for the care of her children. I let my shoulders slump, my eyes glaze, my voice soften. I would not show them what I knew, not yet. Timing mattered now, and if I revealed my hand too early, the flash drive might disappear. The nurse who had given it to me might be pressured into silence, and I might find myself declared legally incompetent before I could even stand on my own 2 feet again. When the door opened, Monique was the first to walk in, her heels clicking against the tile, her smile wide, but her eyes scanning the room as if we are assessing an investment property. She carried a bouquet of lilies that filled the air with their heavy sweetness, a scent that made my stomach turn. Behind her came Darius, tall and broad, his voice booming with practiced concern. "Mama," he said, rushing to my side, gripping my hand as though the gesture could erase everything. "You scared us half to death. You shouldn't be alone in that house anymore. You need people around you. We can't go through this again." His words would have sounded loving to anyone else, but to me, they were a threat disguised as care. "We can't go through this again." That meant they were not done trying. I thanked them softly, nodding, pretending to be moved by their concern, even as my ribs throbbed and my mind replayed the sound of my skull hitting the wooden step. Monique leaned over, placing the lilies on the nightstand, her perfume mixing with the flowers until the air was thick with artificial sweetness. "We brought these for you, Mama," she said, her tone dripping with rehearsed warmth. "And some of your favorite sweet rolls from that bakery on 12th Street. You need to eat, to keep your strength up." She smiled, but her eyes were sharp, flicking toward the drawer of my bedside table. She was searching for something. She was wondering if I had found what they had tried to hide. I let my voice tremble as I said, "You two are so kind. I don't know what I'd do without you." I even let a tear slide down my cheek for good measure, and Monique patted my hand with satisfaction, as though she had won a small battle. But inside, the fury burned hotter, because I understood they were playing the same game I was, but with opposite goals. I was trying to buy time to gather strength, while they were trying to buy time to finish erasing me. The escalation began when Darius pulled a folder from his bag and placed it on the bed. "Mama, when you're feeling up to it, we just need to go over a few things. Nothing urgent, but it'll make sure you don't have to worry anymore. We can handle the boring stuff, and you can just relax." His tone was smooth, but my body went rigid under the blanket. I knew exactly what was in that folder, because I had already seen the files on the flash drive. Forged signatures, guardianship documents, bank transfers, lies dressed up as protection. I forced myself to glance at it without flinching, as though it were no more threatening than a grocery list. "Maybe later, baby," I said softly, squeezing his hand. "I'm too tired today." For the first time, I saw the mask slip. His jaw tightened, his smile faltered, and his fingers pressed into my skin just a little too hard. "Of course, Mama," he said, recovering quickly. "Later." But the flicker of frustration was all the confirmation I needed. He was not here to comfort me. He was here to finish the job he had started on the stairs. Over the next days, their visits became more frequent, always with gifts, always with gentle tones, always with hints about paperwork. I played along, nodding, smiling faintly, never refusing outright but never agreeing either. And each time they left, I felt the tension coil tighter, like a rope being pulled from both ends. I could see the impatience in Monique's eyes, the way she whispered to Darius near the door, their voices low but sharp, the way their smiles grew thinner each time I stalled. The first escalation reached its peak one evening when I overheard them in the hallway outside my room. The door was cracked, and their voices carried through the gap. Monique's tone was harsh, stripped of its sweetness. "She's stalling, Darius. She knows more than she's letting on. We can't let this drag out." His reply was lower, but I caught enough to chill me. "She'll sign, one way or another." My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid they would hear it, but I lay still, my eyes closed, my breathing steady, pretending to be asleep when they walked back in. Darius kissed my forehead, Monique adjusted my blanket, and both of them smiled down at me with counterfeit tenderness. That night, I hardly slept, every creak of the hospital floor making me flinch, every shadow on the wall reminding me that the danger wasn't in the outside world. It was in the faces of the people who called me family. I realized then that my silence could not last forever. Buying time was one thing, but if I waited too long, they would find another opportunity, another staircase, another accident. The flash drive was proof, but proof hidden is no proof at all. I needed to find a way to protect it, to copy it, to make sure it could not vanish if my room was searched. The next morning, I asked the nurse, the same one who had given me the drive, if she could help me make a copy. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If they find out I helped you, I could lose my job." Maybe worse, I reached for her hand, gripping it with what little strength I had. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "You saw what they did. If I don't make sure this gets out, they'll finish what they started." Something in my tone must have reached her, because after a long silence, she nodded. That afternoon, she returned with a small flash drive of her own, and together we copied every file. She kept one, and I kept the other. For the first time since the fall, I felt a sliver of safety. If they took mine, the truth still lived somewhere else. When Darius and Monique visited that evening, I was calmer, steadier. Even as Monique once again placed her hand on mine and asked if I had thought about the paperwork. I smiled faintly and said, "Yes, but I think it's too soon." Darius's smile grew thinner, his eyes darkening, and I knew I had pushed them one step closer to losing patience. But I also knew that the longer I stalled, the more their mask would crack, and the more dangerous they would look to anyone paying attention. The first escalation was not just about their pressure. It was about my awakening. I saw the game they were playing. I understood the stakes. And I knew the proof I held was enough to burn their scheme to the ground if I could just survive long enough to use it. They thought they were circling a weak old woman who could be pushed into compliance, but in truth, I was circling them, biding my time, waiting for the moment to strike back. They thought the fall had silenced me, but I was just beginning to listen more carefully than ever. That was the truth of those days when I returned home from the hospital, still sore in my ribs, still dizzy if I moved too quickly, but sharper in my mind than I had been in years. My body might have been slower, my movements cautious, but my spirit was tuned like a wire pulled tight. I had seen the evidence of their betrayal. I had played the part of the fragile, grateful mother, and I had even managed to make a copy of the files so their scheme would not vanish if they searched my things. Now came the next stage, the moment when my suspicion would either be confirmed or crushed, finding someone outside my own blood who could see what I had seen. The day I stepped back into my house, the air felt different, the smell of wood polish mixed with the faint must of closed curtains, the creak of the floorboards I knew better than the lines on my own hands, the chill of air that had not been disturbed in weeks. All of it was familiar, yet haunted by the memory of that night when I had been pushed down the stairs. I stood at the bottom step, staring upward, my body shivering at the sight of the railing that had bruised my ribs and the steps where my head had cracked against wood. For a moment, I wanted to collapse again, to let the fear swallow me whole. But I forced myself to climb, one slow step at a time, my hand gripping the banister, my breath steady. Every step was an act of defiance. By the time I reached the top, I was not trembling anymore. I was anchored. This house was mine, not theirs, And if they wanted it, they would have to fight me in daylight, not in shadows. It was that same week when the turning point came. My neighbor Carol, a widow who lived across the street, knocked on my door one evening. She was the kind of woman who always noticed more than she let on, someone who watered her garden at the same hour each day and somehow managed to see everything happening on the block without ever leaving her porch. She'd been kind over the years, bringing me sweet potato pie at Thanksgiving, asking after my health when she saw me hobbling with sore knees, and waving from across the street with a smile that carried a quiet solidarity of age and survival. That night, she stood on my porch holding a plastic container of soup, her eyes lingering on the bruises still faintly visible along my cheekbone. "I know you've been through something," she said gently, pressing the container into my hands, "and I don't want to pry. But I think I have something you need to see." I frowned, confused, and she motioned for me to follow her to her house. We crossed the street slowly, the twilight air cool against my face, the hum of cicadas filling the silence. Inside her living room, she pointed to a small black box mounted in her window. "That's my camera," she explained. "I put it up last year after some kids smashed my mailbox. It faces right toward your house. A few nights ago, I went back through the recordings and, well, you should look for yourself." She pressed a few buttons on her laptop, and there it was. Grainy footage, but clear enough to show the outline of my front porch, the glow of the light through the windows, and two figures standing near my stairs. My heart raced as I watched Monique step behind me, her hand pushing hard against my back and my body toppling forward. Darius stood by, his hand half lifted as though he might catch me, but instead he watched me fall, his face frozen in something between fear and calculation. The image of my body crumpled at the bottom of the steps was almost unbearable to see. But worse was the way they stood over me, whispering to each other, before calling for help with frantic voices that now I recognized as rehearsed. I covered my mouth, my eyes burning, my chest aching with something deeper than pain. Carol touched my arm. "I didn't want to get involved if it was nothing, but after I heard you were in the hospital, I just couldn't keep this to myself." I turned to her, tears sliding down my face, and whispered, "You may have just saved my life." Because now it wasn't just forged papers or hidden emails. Now I had a recording, a piece of undeniable truth that showed the world what had really happened on those stairs. The midpoint of my fight had arrived. Until then, it had been my word against theirs, a mother's suspicion against a son's polished charm and his wife's careful lies. But with that footage, I could prove that what happened to me was no accident. I could prove intent, yet I also knew that possessing the truth and wielding it were two different things. To expose them, I needed to step carefully, because if they sensed that I had evidence, they would strike harder, and next time they would not leave me breathing. That night, back in my own house, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the flash drive and the USB stick Carol had given me. The files showed the scheme. The video showed the act. Together, they were enough to dismantle the lies. But where to take them? Who to trust? I thought of the police, of walking into a precinct with the proof in my hand, demanding justice. But then I remembered the whispers, the stories of older black women dismissed as confused, emotional, unreliable. I remembered how quickly Monique had written emails about my supposed memory lapses, and I imagined her standing before an officer, her voice calm and steady, her clothes crisp, saying, "She must have tripped. She forgets things sometimes," and I imagined the officer nodding, choosing their version over mine, just like so many times in our lives when the truth from women like me had been silenced. So I waited. I made extra copies, hiding one in a box of sewing supplies, another in the pages of an old Bible my grandmother had given me. I carried one in my purse everywhere I went, the weight of it like armor. And I pretended, always pretended, when Darius and Monique visited, I let them make my tea, I let them fuss over me, I let them whisper about safety and responsibility, and I smiled faintly, nodding like the obedient mother they wanted. But inside, I was replaying the footage frame by frame, memorizing every detail, every flick of Monique's wrist, every shadow on Darius's face. The true midpoint was not just discovering the video. It was the shift inside me. I was no longer a victim hoping to survive. I was a woman preparing to fight. I had been trained by life to endure. Long nights in hospital wards, years of raising a child alone, decades of pushing against doors that others tried to close on me. Now all of that endurance hardened into resolve. I would not go quietly. I would not hand them my home, my savings, my dignity. I would not be erased. When I closed my eyes that night, I did not see the stairs or the fall, or even the bruises on my body. I saw a courtroom. I saw Monique's face cracking under cross-examination, Darius looking down at his hands when the footage played, the forged documents spread out on a table for all to see. I saw their greed exposed to the light. That vision carried me into sleep, steadier than any pain medicine the hospital had offered. They called me confused, when in truth I was the only one seeing clearly. That is how the next chapter of my fight began, because even with evidence in my hands, even with the weight of proof tucked into my purse and hidden in the folds of my home, I found out how easily a system can bend in favor of those who know how to smile, how to lie, and how to stand with the privilege of youth and credibility. The unfair turn came not from the violence of a shove or the betrayal of a forged document, but from the quiet way authority shrugged its shoulders at my truth. I remember walking into the police station with my neighbor Carol at my side, my hands gripping the small bag where I carried both the flash drive and the video stick. My body trembled with exhaustion, but my spirit was determined, convinced that once the officers saw the evidence, they would act. I told myself that the law was blind, that truth was heavier than lies, that justice would finally move on my behalf. The officer at the front desk was young, barely older than my grandson, his hair cropped short, his posture straight, as if fresh from academy training. I slid the bag onto the counter and told him in a steady voice that I had been attacked in my own home, that I had proof of it, and that I needed protection before it happened again. He looked at me with a polite smile that carried something I recognized too well, patronization dressed up as courtesy. He took the flash drive, plugged it into the computer, and watched the footage without a flicker of emotion. He scrolled through the documents with the speed of someone skimming homework, not with the care of a man holding the fate of another's life in his hands. When he finished, he leaned back, folded his arms, and said the words that hollowed me out. "This doesn't prove intent, ma'am. It could have been an accident. Families argue, people fall. And as for the documents, your children say you've been having memory lapses. They're worried about you." The air went cold around me. My knees threatened to buckle, and Carol gripped my arm to steady me. I could hear her voice rising, indignant, saying, "You saw what we just showed you. That's no accident." But the officer only shook his head, repeating that without clearer evidence of malicious intent, there was nothing he could do, that if I felt unsafe, I should consider living with family or appointing a guardian. The irony was sharp enough to cut my skin. He was suggesting exactly what my son and daughter-in-law had planned, as though their scheme was the reasonable solution to the danger they themselves had created. I left the station with fire in my chest and ice in my veins. Carol muttered curses under her breath, promising she would not let them get away with this, but I barely heard her. My mind was caught on the officer's calm dismissal, on the way he had called me ma'am, with the tone of someone speaking to a child, on the way the word confused echoed louder than the crash of my fall. I knew then that the system would not save me, that the law was not built to catch every cruelty that slips between family ties, that sometimes truth can sit on a desk and still be ignored. The unfair twist deepened that evening when Darius arrived at my door with Monique, both dressed as though they had come from some formal event, their clothes immaculate, their faces painted with practiced sorrow. They stepped inside without waiting for my invitation, moving with the confidence of people who already considered the house theirs. Darius sat across from me, his hands folded as though we were in a business meeting, and he said, "Mama, we heard you went to the police. That was a mistake. They don't believe you, and you know why? Because you've been making things harder than they need to be. You're tired. You're stressed. You need us to take care of things before you hurt yourself again." Monique added her voice, smooth and sharp like glass. "We're not your enemies. We're the only ones who love you enough to tell you the truth. You can't manage all this anymore. The house, the bills, your health. It's too much. The sooner you accept it, the better." She smiled then, a smile that carried no warmth, only triumph. "You should be grateful, really. Not everyone has children willing to step in." I looked at them, their polished shoes tapping against my floor, their hungry eyes scanning the walls of my living room, and I understood that this was their unfair advantage. They knew the system would hesitate, that outsiders would assume the old mother was confused, while the young son and his ambitious wife were responsible and reasonable. They wore the mask of caretakers so well that anyone glancing from the outside would believe them. But inside, I felt something shift. Their unfair turn was meant to crush me, to remind me that even proof could be dismissed if spoken by the wrong mouth. Instead, it hardened my resolve. If the law would not hear me, I would find another way to make the truth undeniable. I would not be silenced by their lies, and I would not allow the word confused to define me. They wanted me erased, but all they had managed to do was awaken every ounce of fight left in my body. That night, as I locked the doors and sat in the stillness of my kitchen, I whispered to myself, "They think I'm cornered, but they don't know the power of a woman who refuses to vanish." And though the injustice of the day weighed heavy on me, I also felt a flicker of something stronger than despair, a determination that the next move would be mine, and when I made it, I would not miss. They wanted me silent, but their arrogance made them careless, and in their carelessness, I found my strength. That is how the next stage unfolded, the point where fear stopped being my master and began to transform into a weapon I could wield. I had already faced the humiliation of being dismissed by the police, already endured the cruelty of hearing my own son speak of me as though I were nothing more than a burden, already tasted the bitterness of knowing the law was more willing to believe the story of a young couple than the truth carried by a black woman with a bruised body and a long memory. What remained was the choice, surrender or escalation. I knew which path I would take, because surrender had never been in my bones. Not when I worked those long shifts as a nurse. Not when I raised Darius alone with no one to lean on but my faith. Not when I fought through every closed-door society, tried to put in my way. It began with a phone call, unexpected, from a voice I did not recognize. The caller introduced himself as a journalist from the local paper, someone Carol had quietly reached out to after the police brushed me aside. "Ma'am," he said, his voice careful but steady. "I was told you might have something important to share. People don't usually want to talk about family matters, but from what I hear, this isn't just a family matter. It's something bigger. If you're willing, I'd like to hear your story." My heart pounded as I listened, the weight of years of silence pressing down on me. I thought of the risks, of Darius and Monique finding out, of them striking harder if they knew I was speaking out. But then I thought of the footage, the forged documents, the way Monique had smiled in my living room as though she already owned it. And I knew my story was not just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who had been silenced, every mother erased by the greed of the very children she raised. I agreed to meet him. The meeting took place in a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee was always too strong and the booths carried the smell of decades of fried bacon. I chose it because it was public, because I knew I would be safer with witnesses around, and because anonymity would shield me from curious eyes. I arrived with the flash drive and the video stick hidden in the lining of my purse, my body aching with every step, but my mind sharp with purpose. The journalist was younger than I expected, barely in his 30s, with glasses slipping down his nose and a notebook already open on the table. He greeted me respectfully, listened as I told my story from the beginning, and his pen moved furiously across the page. When I slid the drives across the table, his eyes widened as though he understood the gravity of what he was holding. "This is serious," he whispered, after watching the footage on his laptop, the diner's neon light flickering across his face. "If what you're telling me matches what's in these files, then this isn't just elder abuse. It's attempted murder." He paused, looking at me with something between awe and anger. "And if the police won't act, we'll make the public act." For the first time in weeks, I felt the heaviness in my chest lift, just slightly, because here was someone who believed me without hesitation, who didn't call me confused, who didn't smile with pity, but listened with urgency. When the article came out 3 days later, it was not buried in the back pages, but printed on the front with a headline that carried the weight of truth. "Local woman claims son and daughter-in-law tried to steal home. Evidence suggests attack." Pshotho. Name was there, my picture too, taken from a church event years ago, and the story unfolded across 2 columns with excerpts of the emails, blurred stills from the footage, and quotes from me describing the betrayal. Carol's voice was included as well, her account steady and clear, testifying that she had seen the footage herself. The paper didn't just tell my story. It amplified it, gave it legs, made it impossible to ignore. The escalation came swiftly. Within hours of the paper hitting doorsteps, Darius was at my house, pounding on the door, his voice booming with rage. "Mama, how could you? You're ruining us. You're destroying your own family." Monique stood beside him, her face twisted with fury, no longer hiding behind sweetness. "Do you know what you've done?" she hissed. "You've embarrassed us in front of everyone. Do you think anyone will respect you now? They'll laugh at you. They'll say you're bitter, crazy, ungrateful." I stood in the doorway, my body trembling but my spine straight, and I answered with a calm I didn't know I had. "They can say what they want. I know the truth, and now so does everyone else. They threatened lawsuits. They threatened to cut me off from grandchildren. They threatened to drag my name through the mud. But I had already been dragged as far as I was willing to go. Their words no longer had the same power, because I had seen what sunlight could do to lies. It made them shrivel. Neighbours began stopping by, some with casseroles, some with quiet words of support, some with stories of their own, of money stolen, of wills rewritten, of children who turned against them. What I had thought was my private shame revealed itself to be a public epidemic, and in their solidarity, I found fuel. Yet escalation also brought danger. Anonymous phone calls began to ring at night, heavy breathing on the other end, sometimes silence, sometimes whispered threats. "Drop it, or next time you won't get up." I reported them, but the police shrugged again, calling them prank calls. Cars slowed outside my house, unfamiliar faces watched from across the street, and I learned to double-lock my doors. Fear wrapped itself around me like a second skin, but underneath it pulsed a fire that would not be extinguished. If they thought intimidation would silence me, they had forgotten who raised Darius in the first place. A woman who had fought her whole life for every inch of dignity she owned. The journalist returned with updates, telling me the story had spread, that bigger outlets wanted to cover it, that advocacy groups for the elderly were reaching out. The more attention it gained, the harder it became for my son and his wife to control the narrative. Monique tried to paint me as unstable, calling into radio stations to claim I was suffering from dementia, that the footage had been misinterpreted, that the documents were standard legal procedures for protection. But the louder she shouted, the more the cracks in her mask showed. People weren't buying her rehearsed charm anymore. They were asking why a mother would go to such lengths if she were not telling the truth. The second escalation was not just about raising the stakes. It was about shifting the balance. I was no longer the isolated, silenced mother. I was now a voice amplified by others, a name printed in bold, a story being told beyond the walls of my home. And though Darius and Monique raged louder, though their threats grew sharper, though the nights felt longer and more dangerous, I knew the tide was turning. They had wanted me erased, but instead I had become visible, undeniable, a woman who refused to vanish. That was when I realized the next step was inevitable. They would not stop, not until they were cornered in a place where the truth could not be twisted or ignored. The courtroom loomed in my mind, not as a place of fear, but as the battlefield where the final reckoning would come. The stage was set, the pieces moving, and I could feel the storm building. My part now was to hold steady, to endure the threats, to guard the evidence, and to prepare myself for the moment when their lies would collapse under the weight of the truth they had so desperately tried to bury. They thought the courtroom would be their stage, but it became their undoing. That was the moment I had been walking toward since the night I hit the bottom of those stairs, the moment when whispers and hidden files and grainy footage would finally step into the light. For weeks, Darius and Monique had fought to control the story, insisting to neighbors, colleagues, and even church members that I was confused, that grief and age had clouded my judgment, that the article in the paper had been sensationalized by a journalist chasing attention. They wore their best clothes to every public outing, held hands tightly like a picture-perfect couple, and spoke in voices laced with practiced sorrow whenever anyone asked about me. But now, in the courthouse, under the unblinking eyes of a judge and jury, their charm was no longer armor. Here, evidence mattered. And here, the mask would finally slip. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the kind of smell that clung to spaces where lives were dismantled and rebuilt through testimony. I walked in slowly, my body still stiff from my injuries, but my back straight, my chin lifted. Carol walked beside me, her hand steady on my arm, and behind us, the journalist sat with his notebook ready. I could feel the eyes of strangers on me, some filled with curiosity, others with pity, but I kept my gaze fixed forward. This was not about pity. This was about justice. Darius and Monique sat at the defendant's table, both dressed in black as though mourning, their lawyer a man with a slick suit and a smile sharp as a blade. Darius glanced at me, his eyes pleading in a way that once might have softened me, but now I saw only calculation. Monique didn't look at me at all. She stared at the judge with the confidence of someone who believed charm could bend even the law. When the proceedings began, their lawyer wasted no time painting me as unreliable. He spoke of my age, of stress, of how memory lapses were common in women my stage of life. He described me as paranoid, confused, unwilling to accept help, and he leaned heavily on the claim that Darius and Monique had only ever tried to protect me from myself. I listened in silence, my jaw tight, every word a reminder of how easily women like me were dismissed in official spaces, our voices softened into background noise. Yet, when my lawyer stood, a calm woman with a clear voice and eyes that held no fear, the air shifted. She laid out the facts. The forged documents, the video footage, the trail of emails. One by one, she placed them before the court like bricks building a wall too high for lies to climb. The moment the footage played was the moment the tide turned. On the large screen, the jury watched as Monique shoved me, watched as I tumbled down the stairs, watched as Darius stood frozen, his hand half raised, but never reaching to stop me. The sound was faint, but the whispers between them afterward could be heard. Call now. Act shocked. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the sound of disbelief colliding with recognition. Monique shifted in her seat, her hands clenching tight around the table edge, and Darius's face went pale. Their lawyer objected, claimed the video was taken out of context, claimed it didn't show intent, but the judge's sharp gavel cut him off. The footage spoke louder than excuses. Then came the emails. My lawyer read aloud Monique's words about how I was too proud to admit she can't handle things anymore, and how we'll take care of it, and she'll thank us later when everything is secure. The jury shifted uncomfortably as those words hung in the air, the casual cruelty of them impossible to disguise. The forged documents followed, the signatures clearly not mine, the dates aligning perfectly with the timeline of their scheme. Each piece stacked upon the last until the weight of evidence pressed down like a storm, leaving no space for denial. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, gripping the edge of the stand, my voice steady, though my body trembled. I told them about the years I had worked to buy my house, about the sacrifices I made for Darius, about the promises he gave me as a child. I told them about the night of the fall, about waking in the hospital with the nurse's envelope in my hand, about the fear that shadowed me every day since. But I also told them something deeper, that this was not just my story, that it was the story of countless mothers and grandmothers who gave everything to their families, only to be treated like obstacles when age made them vulnerable. I looked directly at the jury and said, they tried to erase me. They tried to make me believe my voice didn't matter. But I am here, and I will not be silenced. The silence after my words was heavy, the kind of silence that speaks louder than applause. Even the judge's expression softened for a moment, though her gavel soon called the next witness. Carol testified next, her voice firm as she confirmed what she had seen in the footage, how she had given it to me, how she knew without doubt that what happened was deliberate. Her presence, steady and undeniable, turned the weight of the case from one woman's word to a community's witness. By the time Monique took the stand, her confidence had cracked. She tried to explain the footage, claimed she had stumbled, claimed she was reaching to steady me, but the words sounded hollow against the image replayed in everyone's mind. Darius followed, his voice breaking as he claimed he had only ever wanted to protect me, that he froze from shock, that he never meant for harm to come. But when pressed about the forged documents, when confronted with his own signature beside mine, his words faltered, and his eyes dropped to the floor. The climax was not a single shout or a dramatic outburst, but the steady collapse of a lie under the weight of truth. Piece by piece, their defense crumbled, until all that was left was the undeniable image of a mother pushed by those she trusted most. When the closing arguments were made, my lawyer's voice rang clear. This is not confusion. This is not paranoia. This is courage. And courage deserves justice. As the jury filed out, I sat in silence, my hands clasped in my lap, my breath steady. I had spoken, I had shown, I had endured, and now the decision was no longer mine. Whatever came next, I knew I had already won something greater than a verdict. I had refused to be erased. I had forced the truth into the light, where even those who wished to look away could no longer deny it. When the jury returned, their faces solemn, the foreman's voice steady as he read the words, "Guilty," I felt a weight lift from my chest so suddenly that tears spilled down my face before I could stop them. Around me, Carol squeezed my hand, the journalist scribbled furiously, and somewhere behind me, strangers nodded as though my victory was theirs too. Across the room, Monique collapsed into her chair, her face drained of colour, while Darius bowed his head, the mask finally shattered. The courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It was the place where I reclaimed my name, my dignity, my right to exist without fear. And as I stood to leave, walking slowly but proudly past the people who had once doubted me, I knew the climax was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a new one where my voice would never again be silenced. They wanted my silence, but I walked out of that courtroom with my voice louder than it had ever been. That was the truth of the days that followed the trial, the days when the weight of years of fear began to lift, and I found myself learning how to breathe differently, how to walk through my own house without flinching at every creak of the floor, how to sit on my porch with the evening light soft on my face and not feel watched by shadows of betrayal. The verdict had been read, the guilt pronounced, and though my son and his wife still tried to claw their way out of the hole they had dug, the law had spoken, and for once it had spoken in my favour. Yet, what mattered most was not the legal outcome, not the articles in the paper or the calls from advocacy groups, but the quiet return of something I thought had been stolen from me forever: dignity. When I stepped back into my house after the trial, the air felt different, as though the walls themselves had exhaled after holding their breath for too long. I walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture, the photographs, the worn quilt on the couch, the creaking banister on the staircase. Every corner carried echoes of that night, the crash, the pain, the terror. But each step I took now was an act of reclaiming. I climbed the stairs without trembling, my hand steady on the rail, my breath slow and even. At the top, I turned and looked down, the same view I had seen before I fell, but now I stood tall, upright, unbroken. It was no longer the place of my downfall. It was proof that I had risen. The community changed too. Neighbours who once offered polite nods now came with casseroles, with warm embraces, with apologies for not seeing sooner what was happening behind closed doors. At church, women my age clasped my hands tightly, tears in their eyes, telling me that my fight had given them courage to confront their own families, their own secrets. Younger women listened too, some whispering that they feared for their mothers, that they saw warning signs in their own brothers or sisters. What had once been my private nightmare became a mirror for many, and though I had never asked to be anyone's example, I understood the power of having survived and spoken out. My story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to every woman who had been told she was confused, every mother dismissed as burdensome, every elder silenced by the greed of those she had raised. The journalist who first believed me returned for a follow-up piece, this time not just about the crime, but about the movement that had sprung from it. He asked me to sit on my porch for the photograph, the azaleas blooming behind me, my hands folded in my lap, my gaze steady. The article carried the headline, "She refused to vanish." And when I saw those words in print, I felt a swell of pride deeper than any I had known in years. It was not about revenge. It was about visibility, about being seen and believed, about being acknowledged as more than a frail old woman with shaky hands and fading strength. The legal protections followed too. My accounts were secured, my deed restored, safeguards put in place to ensure no one could ever again manipulate my signature or my voice. Darius and Monique were stripped of any right to manage my affairs, and though the ache of knowing my only child had chosen greed over love will never vanish, I accepted that his absence from my life was safer than his presence. There was grief, yes, grief for the boy he had once been, for the promises he had once made, for the family that might have been if love had outweighed hunger. But there was also peace, a peace born from the knowledge that I had stood firm and had not been erased. I spent more time with Carol, the neighbour whose courage to share the video had tipped the scales. We sat together in her living room, sipping tea, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in companionable silence. She told me stories of her late husband, of her own battles with loneliness and fear, and I realized that what saved me was not only evidence, but solidarity. No one survives betrayal alone. It takes the courage of others, the willingness to say, "I see you, I believe you, I stand with you." In her friendship, I found a reminder that age does not have to mean isolation. The unfair turn of the police dismissal still stung, but even that became part of the lesson. Advocacy groups began using my case as an example of systemic failure, calling for reforms, demanding better training for officers in recognizing elder abuse, especially within families. I was invited to speak at a town hall, my hands trembling as I stood at the microphone, my voice quivering at first, but growing steadier with each word. I told them not just about my son, but about the silence I had carried for too long, the shame that almost kept me quiet, the fear that nearly erased me. And when the room rose in applause, I felt again that surge of dignity, not because I was celebrated, but because I was finally heard. At night, I no longer dreamed of the fall. I dreamed instead of gardens, of music, of laughter with women who understood me. I dreamed of my grandmother's voice, whispering that survival is not enough, that to survive and to speak is to win twice. In the quiet of my kitchen, with the hum of the refrigerator steady, I wrote in a notebook I had kept hidden for years. I wrote my story, not for newspapers or courts, but for myself, so that I would never again doubt what I had endured, so that if ever someone tried to call me confused, I could point to my own words and say, "This is what happened, and this is who I am." The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It became once again a sanctuary, but this time stronger, because it held not just memories of labor and sacrifice, but proof of resilience. The bruises faded, the ribs healed, the fear loosened its grip, but the lesson remained etched deeper than scars. Silence is dangerous, and truth must be spoken even when voices shake. One evening, sitting on the porch with Carol, the newspaper folded on my lap, I looked out at the street bathed in the glow of the setting sun. Children played, dogs barked, neighbours watered lawns. Ordinary life had returned, but I was no longer the same woman who had once been shoved into darkness. I was the woman who had fought her way back into the light, who had faced the unthinkable, and refused to let it define her. They wanted me gone, I whispered, almost to myself, but I'm still here. And with those words, I smiled, not the fragile smile of someone pretending, but the deep, steady smile of someone who had reclaimed her life. The story had reached its end, but mine, I knew, was still unfolding, no longer as a victim, but as a survivor, a witness, and a voice that would not be silenced again.